Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hippo Brain. Here is where we have hippo-sized conversations with people with hippo-sized brains. Many years ago, Rajesh and me met, and we kept having these various conversations with amazing individuals. And we've always thought these are great conversations, they should be stored somewhere. Where better than YouTube? And that's where we started Hippo Brain. We've been on this journey and we intend continuing it. You should have amazing time listening to these Hippo Brain conversations that we've had. We've we've had great fun recording them. We've had great fun talking to these people. We've had great fun revisiting them. Hopefully, they're as useful to you as they are to us. Rajesh?
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Hippo Brain. Today we have a very interesting guest, our first from Southeast Asia, Rahmat Kaimuddin. Rahmat is the CEO of Indonesia's largest e-commerce company, Bukalapak, and we're going to talk about his journey. So Rahmat basically, of course, grew up in Indonesia, studied there, then went to MIT, then spent some time in the US working at Teledyne, and then Stanford MBA, and then returned back to Indonesia, worked in the old economy companies, what we call old economy, for many years. And then in January this year, in 2020, he was brought in by the founders of Bukalapak as CEO. So it's an amazing story that we're going to talk through today. What are the differences between running old economy companies, new economy companies, Rahmat's own personal journey from Indonesia to the US and back. Welcome to Hippo Brain, Rahmat.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh. Very pleasure to be here.
And let's start with your journey. So I guess my initial part would be just to run through your journey and what made you decide to come back after spending so many years in the US?
Okay, how long do you have? So I'll try to keep it a little bit, just the key points, yeah. But basically, it start, as you said, I was born and raised in Indonesia. I grew up in a city called Makassar. It's outside Java, about 2 hours flight from Jakarta. My parents my father is a civil servant. Mom is a homemaker. And actually, when I was 12, and all my siblings were still in school age, my father passed away. And at that time, then my mom opened a small business, selling clothes, opening a small catering business. And at that time, I decided that, I need to help her. So one of the things that I know at the time is to do well in tests. That is probably one thing I know how to do. Maybe at the time I was little good boy, do well in school, and that's it, right? That is all what is expected of you if you live in a kind of like a middle class comfort, and suddenly things change. So I tried to get a scholarship, which I did when I was in high school. So I went to Java, in the city called Magelang. Magelang is where Borobudur Temple is, if you know, and it's near Prambanan Temple is. So I think people in India, probably some of them know, yeah. Borobudur is one of the biggest Buddhist temple in the world. So I studied there, and in a government-sponsored magnet school with 249 other students across Indonesia. And at the time, we always been kind of told that, hey, you will be a future leader of Indonesia, study hard and get back, help lead the country and whatnot. It was a new program at that time. I was the fifth generation, fifth batch, we call it. During that time, I did quite well, won a couple of national competitions, and, get an opportunity to represent Indonesia for like a science Olympiad in Canada at that time. And afterwards, someone from my hometown, friends of my father who happened to be a conglomerate, offered me a challenge. And I said like, hey, Rahmat, if you look like you can do very well in school, if you can get into one of the top universities in the US, I will pay for your school. And yeah, basically I took up that challenge, and I got into MIT, and could basically respect to the gentleman, even though at that time it was 98, after the Asian crisis. He was good for his promise. So he sent me through MIT. I studied electrical engineering there, mostly about semiconductor design. That was kind of like a lot of people learn. There's some computer science, some do electrical engineering. So I thought at the time, okay, I like to see physical stuff. So I studied there, and then graduated right after the dot-com bubble burst in the US. Luckily, I got a job. So, and this is also serendipitous, right? So I was in my third year, my fifth semester, and there is a job fair, and I was just walking around and say like, hey, there's this company. So I put up my resume, and he asked me for an interview. And even though I was a junior, still one more year. And then when I get the offer, I realized that I have enough credit to graduate after 3 years. So I finished up my sixth semester and got a degree. And because of that, luckily, I got a job, even though afterwards the US economy technology.com goes haywire at that time. Yeah. So here I was working for Teradyne. Teradyne make tester equipment. And my second day of job, this is in Boston. Second day of job, I still remember this like yesterday. I went in the morning, and suddenly people make a lot of noise. We checked the TV, and we saw, in the TV, planes hitting towers. So this is my second day of work was 9/11. Yeah, and so but I stayed in the company for a year. They offered me a job opportunity, like extend my visa and whatnot. But then at that time, I felt like, okay, do I want to be here in the US, or I want to basically go back to Indonesia and build my career there, kind of fulfill my destiny, if you will, the one that has been indoctrinated to me since I was young, yeah, in the high school. So went back. Somehow my visa took a long time at the time, but I also knew a few people in management consulting. They offered me a job in the Boston Consulting Group. So and that's what brought me back to Indonesia. And then since then, it's becoming like at the time, management consultant is the talent magnet in Indonesia. We are not that big in technology at that time. If you are an electrical engineer, maybe you work for some manufacturing companies, or you work for energy, state-owned energy company in Indonesia. There's no fab that produce in a commercial scale. So I decided to, use my analytical skills helping companies grow. And then, I went into that sector, management consulting, and then they sent me to business school. And then afterwards, learn about private equity in business school. of course, also I was lucky that I went to business school in Silicon Valley. So learn about technology, venture capital. But again, this is 2006 to 2008. Went back to Indonesia. There is no VC, there's no thriving startup companies or ecosystem. So, I decided to do private equity at the time. Just basically, I feel like I was intrigued by investment. I met Warren Buffett when I was in business school, and I was like, yeah, this guy is very cool. Like allocating capital. That is a great way to create value. If you put the capital into the right place, you can push the country into, or the society. You can make the country, society, the world a better place if you do this right. Consulting, private equity investment, and then in 2014, the gentleman who sent me through college wanted to buy a bank, and he basically called me and said like, hey, Rahmat, I have this business, and we are buying a bank, and we are looking for someone who basically can help us, who knows corporate finance and maybe familiar with finance, and there is no other guy that we can think of. And I remember in 2001, right after I graduated, I wrote a letter to him and said, Pa, thank you for your scholarship. I graduated, I got a job in the US, but if you need me, you call me. And in 2014, he called. So that is kind of like my experience really working in the old economy, because the companies, actually the group has a cement factory, a bank, dealership. There's many businesses. So I sat there kind of playing a few roles, one helping him in the corporate finance, and then afterwards he asked me to be in the cement company for a couple of years, and also as a board member in the bank. And then in 2018, there is a need for the bank to have a full-time CFO, and basically the shareholders asked whether I can be I can play that role for a few years. And yeah, at that time I said yes, so that's why I moved to the bank. And then in 2020 or 2019 end, founder of Bukalapak asked me to join. So that is kind of the story.
It's an amazing story, Rahmat. I think just the whole journey, the way you described it, some element of course, luck, but it's amazing hard work, which basically has gotten you to where you are. What's very interesting is there is you talked about capital allocation. There is a book which you are probably familiar with, The Outsiders by William Thorndike. And you were associated with 2 companies out of the 8 profiled in the book, Teledyne, and of course, you met Warren Buffett. Fascinating. So a question really which comes to my mind is, what made you shift? So you've been doing very well, banking and working with a large sort of conglomerate. What made you shift from banking to Bukalapak?
Yeah, maybe again, this is something that I wrote again 15 years ago. When I applied to B school, my school always asked this question: what matters most to you and why? And what is your career aspiration? And what I wrote at the time is that I want to be a leader in an organization that create big positive impact to a lot of people. That is what I wrote. And then, of course, over time, I try to kind of live my life and career, build my career around, you know, with that task. Am I making positive impacts and whatnot? Of course, you know, commercial bank is a very important job. You know, very respectable in Indonesia. But I mentioned just now, it's when I was asked to move in that job, it was there is a couple of projects, like, you know, some very important, very time critical projects that was given to me, and I needed to get it done, and basically completed those jobs in, like, say, in 2018, and then in kind of by Q3 2019, most of that is done. And sometimes I ask myself, it's like, is there anybody better than me to be a CFO of this bank? You know, this is a very specialized job as well. And you know, the generalist job that I did, I think I completed, and the specialized knowledge that I have is already done. So and at that time, that is when I was approached by the founders of Bukalapak. And if you are approached by a founder of a unicorn, it's kind of an icon in the industry, if you will. It's very flattering, and you have to listen to what he got to say. And then after telling the story about Bukalapak and how you know, how he built the mission of the company, it kind of resonates with me, and I was like, yeah, this is probably my chance to do what I said I wanted to do in 2005. This is a great platform, very mission driven, really create big impacts to the company, and you know, if I don't do it, I will probably regret it. So yeah, I mean, yeah, so that is probably as simple as that.
No, you're right, Rahmat. I think sometimes it's just when opportunity comes knocking, you have to grab it with both your hands. But just there, I'd like to just you said you've had now have a chance to work with a company that is able to create a big positive impact. Now, if you could take some time to explain what is so unique about Bukalapak, and what are the interesting challenges that you face on multiple grounds? One is, of course, from where you were, which is not a startup, to a startup world. How does the management, etc., change? And second, very importantly, you're a professional CEO, which was from a firm that was earlier run by co-founders. So in this thing, if you could, in these aspects, if you could explain Bukalapak and your role in that.
Okay. So Bukalapak was started with a dream to create fairness, if you will. And I think the founder basically have a story that, you know, he was from small city in Java. He sees like entrepreneurs and like a small medium business, and you know, they didn't grow. They stay as is for decades. And you know, the way we think about it is like, you know, Indonesia is, you know, it's a great country, economic growth, a lot of potential, but it is still have it's kind of like most of developing countries face, right? First, it's a huge country, 270 million plus people, 3 time zones, and the challenge is it's comprised of 17,500 islands. Yeah, of course, the one that people know, the top one is Bali, the second one will Java, and Java is, you know, it's very important islands because it's, you know, volcanic, very fertile. You know, all the colonial powers came to Java first, right? And they built infrastructure in Java. Maybe 150 million people in Java, the densest island in the world. So you can think of Indonesia as like, okay, there is this Java island, probably quite well developed, especially in the big cities. And then There is like 5 big other big islands and small islands. There is a lot of infrastructure challenges. Just because people just want to build it in Java. That's where the market is, economic activities, and whatnot. Right? So the thought is, okay, if you don't have capital, then you cannot compete, because if you cannot open mall, you cannot open your business in a mall, you cannot open many branches, you are stuck basically. You open your shop in your nearest market, you open your shop into in your house, and your scale or your coverage is very, very small, right? So capital is one thing, right? How it's hard to open like a proper business. Infrastructure is a challenge. If you are outside of the center of economy, then you find it difficult both to be a business owner or even as a customer. I grew up in Makassar. It's still quite large city, but there's a lot of things that we cannot find in Makassar, but we can find easily in Jakarta, for example. So just to find things is hard. And then because all that, for example, the other challenge we see is financial inclusion. If you want to trade, basically you need the logistics, you need the information technology or communication, you also need the payment, right? And if you don't have that digital currency, if you are not connected in the bank, then okay, you're cash economy, then you can only do it physically. So those are the kind of things that Indonesians are facing, and Bukalapak was started to help create some sort of fairness for all this, right? And the way we think it needs to be done is to create to bring e-commerce platform into everyone, right? So yeah, I mean, I think at this point, because it's quite easy. For example, at the time when we start, internet is there. Indonesia has a lot of internet users, so yeah, that's fine. But the moment we move it into transaction, it's actually the conversion is very small, because people they don't trust it. They don't trust the platform. They don't trust like buying stuff in the phone or in the internet. It's kind of like your money goes to the ether, right? So creating maybe the internet technology, the application, if you will, is relatively simple, but creating an ecosystem that is trusted, that is reliable, working with a lot of logistic companies are solving this logistical challenge, solving these payment challenges. Those are, I think, Bukalapak is all about, and this is very fascinating because it's so fundamental to people's lives.
Yeah, and over here, when it's such a strong mission, it is run by a founder, and now a professional CEO comes in. How do you take it forward? How do you see these challenges?
Yeah, basically, it is that is why when the founders came to me, it was very flattering and confusing at the same time for me. At the time, I was like, really? Because the founder is an icon in the industry. But then he explained to me why what he wants. He said, look, I'm a founder. I started this company in and now it's a unicorn. I have like 2,000 companies, like hundreds of millions of customers, like transactions, like millions of transactions every day and whatnot. And I think it's time for me to disrupt myself. And we, it's not easy to find the people that we think suitable, but we think you are, and you know, are you interested in doing this project? And I was like, okay, I do think that I have some experience running kind of like scaled organization, and hopefully the intellectual and mental wherewithal to take this challenge. So I was like, yeah, you know, if you, I'm in if you are. It's kind of, but of course, the first thing is that I need to download to understand what is the DNA, you know, that mission. It's gonna, because he's kind of passing a very important mission, or like a torch to me, and I need to make sure that I don't drop it, right? Because I'm pretty sure, like, of course, some people will probably join because of the persona of the co-founders, which is a challenge. Some will join for the mission, what we are trying to do, and well, of course, I cannot be the co-founder, right? But what I can do for sure is to ensure that the mission is preserved, if you will, the spirit. And another thing that we discuss a lot with the founders, with the co-founders, and as well as the shareholders, yeah, the supporters, is like, this mission is a very, very long-term mission, and we need to find a way to create this, to run this as a business, you know, to do this sustainably and whatnot. And I think this is also where they think my experience, my expertise, my capabilities comes into play. Like, you know, someone who basically, you know, you create something is one skill, and then scaling, and then after that, move this and maintain this into a sustainable or stable platform, building it as a, you know, people say it's pirates versus navy. Yeah, you know, it's like, okay, this used to be pirates, let's create it as a navy, and that is my task moving forward.
So, Rahmat, I think you got the right analogy, you know, pirates and navy. But if you look at you know, the speed of a startup that is there is quite different from sort of the world of banking and the old economy. How do you adjust? So how does a professional CEO who comes in, what are the changes that you had to personally make in your leadership and your management style to oversee and run a company like Bukalapak, where which is operating all across Indonesia? It's in a cutting edge of technology. It's making difference to hundreds of millions of people. So what are the transitions that you had to do personally?
Yeah. I think the first thing I did is, you know, of course, speak with a lot of people, and I do a lot of self assessment, yeah, a lot of thought, thinking, and basically decide that, you know, there are things that I will add a lot of value by actively contributing, and there are things that I will add a lot of value by just get the heck out of the way, for example. So yeah, I think I'd like to think of myself, you know, maybe not that is not the right statement. I aspire to be someone who is, you know, open and accessible, relatively egalitarian values. Those are something that I think resonates to me. Like, it's kind of cool. And I also remember when I used to work for someone, the leaders that I enjoy working for is the leaders who basically help me to be the best version of I am, right? And basically give me the support, the tools to do what I you know, to improve and to do my job well, and also maybe sometimes nudge me and, you know, pull my ears if I'm being naughty or whatever, right? So keep me. So that is what I was trying to do. So first is like, we state what is our mission. We reiterate that, if I can say it in very short sentence, what I want to do moving forward is I want to do our mission sustainably. So those are the kind of two things, mission and sustainability. Those are the two things. The other things may be less important. Sometimes, people was like, oh, someone else's valuation is better than you, or someone else get this award, why are you not, or something like that. So I was like, oh, those are, having my face on TV or in the magazines, whatever, all this kind of is much less important than us focusing on how can we do this mission, and we have to do it sustainably, because this is a very long-term mission. One cannot live after the other. And so after we clarify that, then we start asking what do they need, what are my team needs, because they know what to do. And having all these conversations. So a lot of this, me saying a lot repetition of, okay, this is the mission, this is what we're gonna do, all this kind of stuff, and having kind of deep conversation on the problems that they're facing, and hopefully we will be able to provide the tools or the environment so for them to thrive. So there is this book called Turn the Ship Around. It's about a guy, he's a captain of a submarine in the US, and he's a very strong technical leader. He knows everything about the ship that he thought he's gonna run. And it's like, which kind of, I relate to that as well. It's like, okay, I want to know everything that's going on. And then he was moved into a ship that is very bad, like the bottom, and he did different technology. He doesn't know what's going on in that ship. And he was like, okay. And then what he decided to do is he create leaders in the rank. It's like, okay, I will help you do that. So it kind of resonated to me in this situation, because there are many people who knows the technology much better today than me. That being said, I'm a nerd at heart, and I have I'm a proud man as well. So I'm trying to learn right now. So my stupidity is not doesn't cost the company, and hopefully it doesn't cost my team as well.
Yeah, what you're saying is, I hear you. What you're saying is that there are a lot of moving parts. You ensure there are enough leaders, add value where you can, and get out of the way. And the challenge and the most interesting thing is to know when to do what. Yeah. So tell me on Bukalapak, as you explained, Indonesia is a large, wide country and lots of islands, 17,500 islands. Running e-commerce there would be a challenge in itself, trying to get the logistics, and it's a two-sided marketplace as well. So you have to figure out the demand, you have to get the supply, you have to ensure that they are connected, they meet, and ensure the transaction happens. There are so many moving parts. How do you decide what to prioritize? What should I move first? What is important, and what are the challenges that you face on that?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, sometimes people ask me also about banking and e-commerce, and one of the things that I can say is, banking is also kind of like a two-sided platform, and there is a few interesting characteristics of a two-sided platform. Yeah, first is like, because you don't have the goods per se, your margin is limited. The room for margin is limited, right? Because you are an intermediary, if you will. The other thing is, you have to be perceived as someone reliable and trustworthy. So reputation is very important. And again, if you are successful, you have to deal with a lot of things. Yeah, a lot of parties, everything, right? It's very complex. So, when you think about it, it's a very hard job. And so hard job that is of limited margin. So, yeah, I mean, just sometimes like, oh, why do you want to do this? But I guess if it works, it will work very beautifully. And that is I think something that maybe we can say is a competitive advantage of the moat, if you will, right? You just need to, one, reputation is very important. Reputation, because otherwise, if there's no reputation, you're not trustworthy, reliable kind of things, nobody want to be intermediated by you, right? So that is one, and it's again same in banking. Reputation is very important, and the fact that our margin is limited, meaning that we just have to think to be efficient every time. Like, if I were to do something, will I be able to do this in a most efficient manner? Like, because premium, very expensive solution will not work because you don't have that room. And the third one is maybe connected also is you have to be able to handle complex transaction in the scalable manner. So I would say the critical part is one thing to do is to have this mindset embedded to the team. It's like, hey, we are not like other technology company with, like, let's say the search engine that have, like, margin of 70% or 90% or whatever, right? This is hard work, hard complex work, and you have to find what is the most efficient solution, scalable solution, how to deal with multiple parties, and whatnot, right? And all the while keeping your reputation intact. So yeah, I mean, I think like everything, yeah, having this problem statement, or, like, the key point is define first. That is one thing that I'm doing. So, because, for example, okay, people sometimes think, okay, creating like a cool technology. Okay, that is cool, but how is that impacting our reputation or scalability, or our ability to handle or efficiency? Those are the things that I know it probably sounds quite fluff, yeah, but it's very important, I think.
I think, Rahmat, you explained it beautifully. I think the analogy with banking and what Bukalapak is doing, I think is fascinating. Both are, in a way, two-sided marketplaces: trust, reliability, low margins, efficiency, and creating something which can scale infinitely, in a way. I think are both relevant. I can now see why the founders chose you to come in and run Bukalapak. I think the way, there's so many similarities, in a way, to the banking business. It's fascinating. Looking forward, how do you think in terms of strategy in a fast changing digital company? Because there's a lot of capital coming in now into Southeast Asia and especially Indonesia. It's one of the fastest growing markets in the region, in the world, actually. And so how do you think of strategy? Strategy is about making choices. So I'm sure you face a lot of these decisions on an ongoing basis. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think basically, like we Indonesia is is a very big market, right? And I just reread this book, and just recently I shared this to my team this week, actually, of the book from Zero to One by Peter Thiel. And he was describing about the rise and fall of the clean tech industry. And they said like, hey, energy is a big segment. It's a huge segment. And of course, you know, someone who can conquer this will be great, right? But a lot of people fail in the clean tech investment because, you know, they say, okay, big segment, here's capital, run with it, right? But the winner is the one that can provide a superior solution to a problem. And you know, capital, like a lot of investment, a lot of players, it can be distracting for us, because there's always kind of newer, shinier peers, like people who want to do this. Yeah. But the way I think about this is like, look, let's not worry about. We should be worried more whether we have been able to provide superior solution for the problem. Yeah, whether we can create like basically, you know, we have chosen our segment, which is what I said. We want to serve the underserved. We are choosing our segment, small and medium enterprises, mass market. So our commerce platform maybe not 100% geared to all the population, like, you know, maybe say middle up, the one that is already being served by a lot of people, or people who live in the commercial centers in Jakarta. Those are not the ones that that probably will benefit from our service. So this problem, to provide the super solution, at the moment we decided to think of what are their pain points. Yeah, because there is still a missing link between kind of like, okay, Indonesia, 170 million people using internet, but the e-commerce transaction is still very low. And we thought, okay, the problem is about not only about creating a platform, e-commerce platform, and promote it such that people are using it habitually. If you do that, maybe you are kind of serving the same guys. And we know how to do it. We have been doing that for more than a decade. We know these people, and we have our own market for that, right? But if you were to really focus on solving these problems, on you know, fairness of commerce, we have to solve the digital currency problem. We have to solve this trust problem. And fact of the matter is, in Indonesia, people still like to buy from mom and pop shops. They like to go to their neighbor mom and pop kiosk. I don't know what they call it in India, kirana probably. Yeah, we call it in Indonesia warung. And if they don't have digital currency, they still pay by cash. So 3 years ago, Bukalapak decided to basically give technology to these warung owners or kirana owners. And with that, so we create an application whereby basically they can do a few things. The first thing is, in our online marketplace, we have a lot of capabilities to sell to basically intermediate virtual products, phone credits, paying taxes, you know, invest, buying gold, buying mutual funds, loan, all those kind of capabilities is already quite mature in our online marketplaces. By pay like in travel tickets, and these warung owners, they didn't have that capability before, right? They just buy their FMCG and they sell it to their neighbors. The neighbors, if they're not connected to e-commerce, and the only access to commerce is through the warung, right? So when we empower this, suddenly the warung owners have new SKUs that they can trade, yeah, and the people in the surrounding areas, basically are supported. They are connected now in the virtual product. And then the second thing is what we did. We worked with a lot of principals, distributors to create multiple distribution centers across Indonesia. I was just being informed today we cover more than 90% of CDs and regencies in Indonesia. With those distribution centers, now the warung owners can order stuff, can order their physical goods, and will deliver it within 1 day. And because typically they are owner operator, they don't have any other employees. If they run out of something, they have to close down shop, they have to go buy, and they are kind of losing time, there is an opportunity cost on that. And with our kind of technology or ability, we want to give them better margin because less inefficiency, right? Because we have all the data and whatnot, are operational. And then the beauty is that a lot of these warung owners start ordering from Bukalapak, and they sell to their neighbors. So immediately, this online merchants that we have in our marketplace get new market. These are the market that was not touched before by online, right? And then the neighbors of this warung suddenly is connected through e-commerce, through an agent, if you will, that they trust. They can pay cash, they see their face. So I think that is a strategy, if you will. It's like, okay, our strategy is to focus on the problems at hand, the market at hand, and go there. Of course, this is hard work, and this is where the rubber hits the road, and the growth is not immediate. You sign up these people one by one, and so we have to shift our resources from the online into this offline. And sometimes when you search Bukalapak, there are other online marketplaces that kind of basically have more transactions than us, which is, it comes with a certain judgment as well. It's like, you are losing market share. But the way I look at it is like, hey, if I create this solution and I compare our progress versus yesterday, I see our numbers versus last year, for example, I see a lot of growth, and I felt like, we are successful in solving this issue so far. Of course, there's still long way to go. Still many things. And once we created this platform, the online marketplace, the O2O, online to offline, and we kind of connect them together, it's a very powerful platform. And now the job is making sure that the cost to run it is still still efficient, and more efficient than yesterday, scalable, putting more people in the platform, and I think it's a very fascinating project so far.
Yeah, it is. And Rehmat, I think what I love what you're saying is that while it does look like a startup has enough and more capital and access to a lot of capital, what you rightly said, capital can be distracting. You don't have capital to do whatever you want to do. You have capital to run all the experiments so that the per unit cost keeps going down of what you want to do. I think that is the challenge that you're trying to explain, saying that don't look at capital to blow and try and do lots of things. Do few things, do it right, but ensure that you get scale in what you do. Is that fair,
Absolutely.
Ahmad?
Yes, I couldn't put it better.
Yes. So, what is the one? There is a long term and a short term play that you have. You have some short term objectives to achieve. You have to show some numbers. But I hear you. What you're saying, you invest in the long term because you at the end of the day, if you don't invest in the long term, slow, steady strategies that will pay off big over a long period of time, uh, that is where you need to allocate capital. But as a CEO, you're always running two horses together because at one point of time as a startup, you have to constantly show growth. If you're even little going off and down, you will be questioned, people will ask you. But at the same time, your mission and the vision and the passion and the scale that you're trying to run is to crack something really big. How do you manage these two?
Yeah, you just have to do both, I think. um,
That's an
so
easy answer.
I think growth is very important. It's a show of whether we are doing the right thing, right? And of course, our stakeholders, our shareholders are always asking us, and yeah, we always ask ourselves as well: Are we doing the right thing? And the day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter, year on year. So far, I would say. Then the question is which growth, that is the thing, and what do you compare, right? For example, I would say the quality, the growth that I want to see is that is kind of related to mission and sustainability, right? If I don't want us to grow selling $1 for 75 cents. If we sell, $1 for $1 and a penny, then okay, that is good. So at least we know that our product is very valuable. People are willing to pay for it. And then the question is, okay, with 1 penny, can you run? What can we do so that if, let's say, your cost now is $1, can you grow negatively or per unit cost? So I think, of course, top line growth, we are all for that. It's just that there are times when, sometimes you say like, okay, other guys is growing this, and why are you not? That is the kind of things that says like, hey, we don't look at that growth, look at this growth. And of course, some of this growth that we are talking about, because we are not public company yet, we don't share. So, but I share it to some of my, to the team. Sometimes it's like, hey, I know sometimes newspaper says like this and that, but here is what I see, and here's why I'm still smiling in the morning. And and then I will be worried if there's something else. And this kind of mindset, yeah. I think if, let's say, our per unit margin is not improving, our, let's say, some of these metrics per our employee and whatnot is not improving, and even our top line growth is not improving, I will be very, very worried. And I think our stakeholders, and rightly so, we have to be pushed towards that. Yeah. But again, because we believe we are working on, or we are playing our own game, there is a certain targets and missions and sustainability that we want to go through. That is the other ones, that this vanity metrics or distractions, I try to put that aside and not make my team very, very stressed out because of that.
Yeah, great point, Rahmat. In fact, what you're saying reminds me of this book by Simon Sinek, The Infinite Game, where you have to have the long future and you're building the foundations right. There's one sort of, as we come to the close, there are a couple of questions I want to just run through with you. One is that what would be your advice to someone who's moves from a sort of old economy company to a new economy company? If there are one or two, because we are seeing a lot of these transitions happen now as the new tech companies are becoming bigger in scale, people are sort of moving. So based on your learnings, what is the one or two things you would advise to such people, managers?
Yeah. I don't know whether advice is the right term because I don't think I'm successful yet. Yeah, maybe in a few years, if I were successful to create that, then I can. But maybe a few things that I keep reminding myself. Basically, you know, we have to be open-minded first, right? Of course, if you are like, you built your career for decades, there are things, that you got used to and whatnot. This is quite different in a lot of ways. Yeah, things are, moving faster. The way they do things is different and whatnot. So yeah, we just have to be like, don't force your personality kind of or your constitution to the organization. You just have to kind of blend in and become part of that. Yeah. But that being said, I think there are a few fundamental truths in the business. Yeah. What I described about intermediary business, I think it's quite important. Those are the critical things. Sometimes the fundamental economic equation about, there's this quote in the book called Great Game of Business that I really like. Basically, the goals of a business is to make money or create profit and generate cash. And if you want to be sustainable, you have to have that ability. And of course, that mission is important. But how the connection to create, to make money or create profit and generate cash, it has to be also need to be thought about. Yeah. Because sometimes people say like, okay, you just have to burn money and show growth and everything will work out. And if it doesn't sit well in your stomach, maybe for a reason. So that one probably you have to keep in your, because some of us like to say is, again, providing superior solution really for a problem. This is not a game of who can fundraise the best. Right. And I know, Regis, you will probably relate to this a lot, yeah, with your Proficorn statement. And of course, we have to do promotion. We have to do all of these things. But okay, first, open-mindedness have to kind of, if you're surrounded by a species which is this, hard-charging, aggressive tech guys and whatnot, you have to kind of understand where they are from, be open-minded, learn. Because in the end of the day, I think a lot of people still human being fundamentally similar, right? They want to do good job, they want to do good things, they want to be respected, they want to leave legacy and whatnot. The style very different, so I have to be open. And the economic though, you have to be. You probably will be the guardian of this value.
Beautifully put. So one last question for you. When you look back, and it's been a fascinating journey and story that you've sort of outlined, if there is one turning point in your life, which you look back, which really made Rahmat, which made you who you are, what do you think that would be?
Well, there is a lot of things, of course, but let me try to tell probably a little bit of story. I think one of my biggest regret in my life is I spent a lot of my time thinking that I was special. Maybe if you read this book, The Mindset, I'm probably like, hardcore fixed mindset there, right? Think, I did very well in school, and I keep doing things that I was already very good at. Little bit worried about my reputation, so I didn't do things that maybe make me fail and whatnot, right? Until failure was brought to me in a very very interesting manner, at least for me, and I still remember this yesterday. So I just got back from international competition, right? So this is after high school. I applied to one school in Indonesia at that time. There's an engineering school in Indonesia. I didn't apply to anywhere else at the time. This is even before the challenge to go to the US. So I thought, look, I'm a top student in a top high school, team leader in a national competition. For sure, I will get a slot in this university. And the Indonesian test is basically you just took one test, and the outcome is whether you pass or fail. You don't know your score. You don't know why. And I didn't pass. So at the time, I felt like, my world was turned upside down. And it's like, I called my mom and it's like, hey, so how? I said, I didn't pass for the test. I was like, don't joke around. He's like, no, I'm not. So what do you want to do? I said, I don't know. And I was like sitting there, like, feeling like the world ends. And then afterwards, I think about it. I was like, look, how can I define my failure is actually, would that define me? Like, just because I fail one thing, would that make me a failure? And that by definition also, like, whether my success is earned or whatever, right? So then I decided that, okay, focus on learning. And this is another advice that is great. So just after I get my acceptance to MIT, my sponsor brought me to meet Professor Habibie, who was a president at the time, and he's a president of Indonesia, and he was like the top engineer. He's a aircraft engineer. It's like considered the smartest guy in Indonesia at the time. Like all the science-oriented kids wants to be like him. He's my childhood idol. And he told me something like, hey, Rahmat, I studied because I want to know, not because I want to pass. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. So yeah, and from until then, I tried to like, okay, every time I get a challenge or things that I can do, even with the cost, the potential cost of not doing well, get a B or get a C, but I think I can learn a lot, or I'll try to take it. Of course, if it impacts with a lot of people, then I need to ask myself whether failure is not an option, right? on some things, I'm not just trying to experiment with other people's lives. When I took something, I know I need to be sure that I can do it, but doesn't have to be kind of like a smooth sailing all the time. So those are the kind of period, I think, that changed a lot of my life's perspective.
Wonderful. I think I've learned a lot listening to you. I think this idea of lifelong learning, you've been a wonderful teacher today. Rahmat, I think everyone who watches this, there's so many takeaways at so many different levels. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Jemit for the closing words.
Yes, thanks, Rajesh. Thanks, Rehmat. I think I learned quite a lot today. And this want to know, I go to school, I go and study because I want to know, not because I want to pass. And I think that's when I go back and I think through, that's some of the best times and the most joy I've had, whether it's business or whether it's working at school or wherever, the ability to know. And what I take a lot away from you is that the mission of your company is to promote trade and to bring about fairness. And I agree with you that trade is the cornerstone of prosperity. If you want to take your country and your people into prosperity, trade is going to be so important. And there was a movie, and I don't know if you know Shah Rukh Khan, and it was a very popular movie. And there was a dialogue that, and I'll explain, first say it in Hindi and then I'll explain कि कोई धंधा बड़ा या छोटा नहीं होता और धंधे से बड़ा कोई धर्म नहीं होता, which basically means is no trade, no business is big or small, no work is big or small, and there is no greater religion than business. So I resonate with what you say, and I resonate with the vision and the mission of your company and the ability to bring equitable fair trade to everybody. And that is the only way a nation and a people and the world can move up and come out of all the problems and issues that they have. And thank you, Rehmat. It was an absolutely lovely conversation, a true Hippo Brain. Any last words from you?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And basically, if you listen to the story, I apologize if I say wrong things and whatnot. But yeah, hope there is a positive that can be taken. We call it, it is from God, and the mistake is all mine.
Rehmat, you're truly a nice, humble human being, and I have to just learn that much. If I learn that much from you, I think I'll be in a far better place. Thank you for being on Hippo Brain. It's where we get these amazing conversations. We hope to expand and have many, many more Hippo Brains. You can watch us on YouTube, subscribe, press the bell icon. You can get it on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for being a great audience. Thank you, Rehmat, for being an absolutely awesome Hippo Brain.